Welcome, everybody. My name is Melissa Mari, and you folks know me from Shadow Tech Alchemy. And I am starting this brand new interview show called Living Gold, where I feature people and teachers of all sorts who, through not necessarily always adversity, but through their challenges in life and through their deep connection to their soul path, they're able to progress and live their gold, live their life art path. So I'm very happy this week to share Sara Cross and her story. Where I found Sara was came on our Zoom Shadow Tech Alchemy calls, and anything that came out of her mouth was filled with wisdom, and I was very intrigued. And she also was always using her hands. And so I started to look at her pages and her work and what she's doing. And then I found out that she had been born with cystic fibrosis. And most people who get diagnosed with that don't even live as long as she's lived now. So it's an incredible story that I want to share with you. And she wrote a book, and it's called Addicted to Being Alive. And that's her art there. She does incredible different kinds of art. We're going to put her links below here. She has her own Etsy store. She does commissions for clothing. She's a master seamstress. She knits, and she's incredible. So I'm just going to, hi, Sara, and hand it over to you, and just tell us from the beginning your story and what's happened to you.
Well, hi, Melissa. Thank you for asking me to come on and do this. I'm quite honored for that because it's a bit of a weird story. I think it's kind of unusual. I mean, it's not unusual for people to have hardship stories. This is, I think, becoming more and more of a regular thing in a world that's, barreling towards, you know, just a harder and harder world that we're living in. But it is odd because I learned a lot. Well, I kind of progressed in a really odd, slow way, I think, and it happened through the course of my whole life instead of just some sort of like very specific aha moment where I just turned on. It was kind of just something that built and built and built, and it stacked until I had experience, with my own history and just with understanding and having a wherewithal with the general world. So everything that I put in the book is from that. And a lot of it had, I mean, a lot of my turning on, spiritually part of me, that did come from a physically hard experience, just being born that way. And that happens sometimes. And
Can
I
you,
don't feel like,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but can you just explain to people who don't know what cystic fibrosis is, just basically what it is?
well, it is an inherent, um, which means you're born with it, genetic condition. It is a mutation of the CFTR gene. So it basically causes dysfunction within the biology As far as chloride dysfunction, your body doesn't process chloride very well. So this causes a lot of buildup of mucus, and which can lead to severe issues throughout the entire body. It can also mean that you're born without the natural enzymes it takes to digest and process food. So your body won't take in nutrients unless you're forcing it with medical institutional medication or by just consuming lots and lots of food all the time, which is crazy. But it's it's inherited. You get it. It's a roll of the dice. It's some families have lots of it in their family, where it's like every other member of their family has CF, and lots of families like mine have never even heard of it. So it was a complete mystery, even in my own history.
When did, were you immediately put into a hospital at a very young age?
I don't remember a lot of my younger years. That's still something I'm kind of working on. But what I do know from being told is that when I was born, it was just, I just kind of looked like I was a bit wrong in a way where I didn't act very normal, I guess. I don't know. And they didn't really discover that I had CF until I was about 6 months old. And up until that time, it was just this going to different doctors and trying to figure out or connect to somebody who had maybe an inkling of a clue as to what it may be. So all I really know is that I was basically starving and crying for 6 months, the first 6 months of my life.
So it's hard to breathe. Is that like the main, you've mentioned to
Yes.
me before that it's like having cement blocks on your lungs or something like that?
Yes. It's primarily a lung and pancreas disorder.
Okay.
The mainstream medical institution mostly will call it a disease, but it's not really a disease. Like I said, it's a genetic deformation,
Right.
it's a mutation. So it's primarily lungs and pancreas, but they're finding the longer people with CF live, which is mostly attributed to things like proper understanding of how physiotherapy should actually work, and modulator drugs, which are still pretty modern, like within like the last, I don't know, 20 years or so, where they've been given to us or starting to give to us. They're finding that when you progress the hormones or biology of the male or female, depending on what they are, this will change because that's what the human body does naturally. And the mutation changes, and how it behaves in your body will change with it.
I see. Okay. So now we have a basis. So you spent a lot of time in the hospital as a kid, right? In your book, you talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I had a lot of like the first little fraction of my childhood. I don't remember a lot, and I don't know if it's just because I was too young to really remember and take it all in consciously. I'm sure I have it all in my mind subconsciously, but consciously I wasn't really like tuned in to it, I guess. So I don't really remember a lot of it, but what really made me conscious of it in a very big way was when I turned 13. That was a very, very big year for me, because that was when things became very specific and very real in regards to how my health, more how CF really worked and how it was affecting me.
So prior to that, you were at home most of the time and was your childhood before that normal, or were you still dealing with a lot of the issues?
I was still on, I remember still being on medications.
Mm-hmm.
I've been on something called Creon for the majority of my life. So with it was very normal for me to be taking pills every time I eat.
Mm.
I also had nebulizers. Um, I remember I have vague memories of being in the hospital as a very young child and an out, but I don't know if it particularly pertained to me or if it was for another reason. And I think it's just because CF is progressive in nature. The older you get, the more it levels up. It goes through jumps. 13 was the time I think when my body started to really react in a pretty heavy negative way to the mutation. So the enzymes in the nebulizers and whatever seemed to be doing it for me until my body started to biologically change. And then the year I was 13, that was when all hell broke loose, and I was hospitalized quite a bit from that point on. So it's a progressive thing, and everybody who has CF is a completely different thing. I mean, there's no book that anybody can look at.
So, one thing I've noticed about you is that you have a very strong, we talk about it, there's different archetypal energies that different people are using more of or have more access to. And for you to survive what you've gone through in your life, you naturally developed this warrior archetype. And did you notice like internal strength or something that clicked that made you realize that you had to start take responsibility for this illness that you were born with?
Well, it's kind of yes and no to that, because it's like having two
Hmm.
personalities almost, which sounds crazy, but you've got one part of you that is you're full of fear, you're a bit nihilistic. Like if you're in a position where you have, quote, what's called a child's disease, which is the box that we're put in.
Right. That's a
You
thing in
have,
itself, just being put into a box.
you're being labeled
Right.
into this corner, like that's where you belong. So you develop, as far as people I've met, as far as how I've done it, you develop sort of this like two personality complex. So you have one part of you that you don't always really let out or deal with or really analyze or really show to the world. You have in that your insecurity is mostly what it is, and it's all based, it's a fear-based response because even if maybe you're not told directly you have this child's disease, and the clock is ticking faster for you than others, there's a life expectancy cap, this is something we like learn to, we just figure it out,
Mm.
whether we're told that or it's like something that, how people behave around us, it's
Right.
that energy's there. So you have this fear-based insecure personality disorder inside, so that causes you to perhaps compensate in maybe an unhealthy way, and you might go very religious, or you might be very nihilistic, or you may just go into this like weird deep pity hole
Mm-hmm.
that I call it. But at the same time, you're being um, conditioned. I mean, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, I think, but I think it's kind of accidental. But you're being conditioned by um, people in the medical field, people who run charities like Make a
Mm-hmm.
Wish, and the CF organization and your parents and whoever cares about you that you are a warrior, and they put that stamp on
Oh,
you.
I
So
see. Yeah.
it, it's kind of building this like really weird
Mm-hmm.
combination. Like in one part of your personality, you are this child, you're this child's disease.
Right.
You've got a death hanging over your head. And on the other side, you're this warrior, and they literally give you those two labels at the same
Yeah.
time, which is very frustrating in a way when you really think about it,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
you're battling two things that don't go together.
Yeah, and it also puts a negative connotation on that word itself, on warrior. And actually, the way that I'm framing the warrior archetype through the Jungian model is our will. This is your will, which is coming from your deep S self. It's coming from your source. This is your prana. This is, the warrior is incredibly conscientious and gets the job done. And there's all these very positive, you know, um, positive things about the warrior energy. It's so important, and there's so many people in life who need more of this archetype. So it's interesting that this whole organization that's putting this whole disease onto you, which even labeling people diseased is, in my view, is very negative, because that puts you into a box in itself, saying you have this disease, and you're going to have to do this for the rest of your life, and all these different things. So that in itself is well, I would consider it on the evil side. I know that people within that organization they mean well, and everybody wants healing, but then, and I know that you're very familiar with the medical system and all this, and that there's a shadow side of the medical system and our system in general. And so they take these words and they take these strong images, and then they use it in a way of a certain kind of a manipulation, in a way. So I can see where you would have that split, that way. The other thing is, just to survive, I told you about IFS, internal family systems theory. Richard Schwartz is the main guy, but when we have any kind of trauma in our childhood, and in your case, your whole life, basically, we have these parts in our psyche that split in order to protect ourselves. So you have protector parts, manager parts, you have what is called exiles, and they're the parts that you're trying to protect. These are split off parts. So in a way, when you describe that splitting off, it could be partially that too. But what I guess I'm trying to have you talk about is, and I think you were about to start, was like when you were 13, something happened and it triggered something in you. So you,
Well, I think that I mean the turning online part in my mind, I think a lot of that was really just a subconscious part of me, because I was aware of what's happening, but it was the internal part of me that felt the panic behind it. So, I mean, being 13, you're a kid, you're, usually kind of thoughtless and just everywhere, emotionally. And it was just a weird year for me, because that was the year that I spent the majority of that school year quite ill.
Mm-hmm.
And this may have been what set off my disdain or my untrusting nature to the medical establishment at large. I spent the majority of that school year being taken to a local general practitioner who was the family doctor, and he just he spent that whole year putting me on and off pharmaceuticals. Try this, try that, and every single one was just this epic failure that all did really weird, messed up side effects to me, and none of it worked. So, because he was trying to treat what he saw externally,
Mm-hmm.
but he wasn't connecting the
Yes.
fact this is genetic. I don't have a disease. I have a genetic reoccurring cycling issue. It's a genetic problem. It's a condition. So eventually, after almost the end of the school year, I was then finally sent up to Boston's Children's Hospital, where there was only one doctor who had ever actually even heard of CF in that area, or even dealt with CF at all. And I remember her being an Irish doctor who came over from Ireland. And now I know it makes sense because Ireland has one of the highest populations of CF in the world. So it was kind of lucky that she was there at that time.
So you spent a lot of time that year by yourself. See, a lot of this also goes with the shamanic archetype, which usually there's some sort of a healing crisis as a child, or they have very intense experience either of being almost dying and being sick. And then it triggers this, it's a magician part, the shaman part of the psyche, or it truly is an archetype. And I've noticed this with a lot of what I would call wounded healers, or people who are on this healing path and end up bringing their gold to the world, is they have something happen when they're children that stimulates them going on a search for, besides their healing, for something much deeper than that, which is their gold. So when you were going through that year, were you starting to do things like what you're doing now, sewing or making stuff, or what did you do? Like, because you were alone a lot.
Well, I mean, I had, one or two friends. I was put in the outcast, obviously, of the kids in the area.
Mm-hmm.
All the kids who were odd or strange, or just that the rest of the community didn't really fully understand, which is fine. I don't mind being in that place. So I had a one or two friends, and we hung out sometimes. A lot of the time, I was in the hospital, or I was in and out of just being kind of sick. And ended up spending a lot of time alone, like at the public library,
Mm-hmm.
or just, doing stuff like that. And I did do a lot of reading as a kid, not necessarily anything that was spiritual. It was mostly like stuff I was
Yeah,
interested
I
at that
did that
time.
too. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then with the, being the crafty side of me, like it's kind of my family. So I always had the influence as all the way from a young kid of women who sewed
Mm.
in my
Mm-hmm.
family. So I think the first time I had an experience with actually sewing was, I might have been 7 or 8 or 9, something like that. but some of that time is a little bit foggy. But I just know I've done that. I've had that in my life
Mm-hmm.
always. So um, it was easy for me to use that as something to put my energy into. And I kind of got used to using that as this tool that allowed me to pull back and think about things.
Mm.
Like I didn't mind really being alone. Like, I mean, saying that it sounds really, oh, yes, like sad, but I didn't really mind being alone or doing things by myself or just being left alone. But it was a hard year generally just because, you know, people can be uh, cruel, even unintentionally, when they don't understand something of what they're looking at. And I didn't look well. So it was off putting for my community.
Yeah, that is very difficult, but this again goes along with that archetype, the shaman archetype of being okay. I was in a similar kind of um, situation. I got sick a lot as a kid, and I was through a certain period alone a lot. And it didn't bother me at the time either. I was always kind of the outcast. And these all stem from this similar kind of a recipe of these archetypes that are going on. So after that, I know that at one point, and this was when you were in your early 20s, you went over to England. What spurred that whole change of going over there?
Well, I ended up moving to Ireland. Um, but I was always kind of, we moved around a lot
Mm-hmm.
just because it's not because of anything officials, more just we moved around a lot. So I wasn't really somebody who was worried about travel or
Mm-hmm.
moving or picking up and going. I've never had that problem with, because the way I kind of grew up was, home isn't where, I grew up with my whatever house. Like, home is where I hang my hat. So that could be literally anywhere in the world. That's how I viewed that. And I know that can be difficult for some people to just leave. So, but what happened was I ended up moving to Ireland, and that's
Was that
where
with
my
your
kid was born.
family or was that?
No, it was on my own. It
Mm-hmm.
was, so my ex-husband, now ex-husband, he was from Ireland, and that's why I ended up being in Ireland,
Where did you meet him?
here in Massachusetts.
Oh, okay. Okay, and then he went back and then you went over there to live over there? Okay.
Yeah. So I wasn't a stranger or felt any kind of real anxiety about having adventure.
Mm-hmm.
I had no problem with traveling.
Okay, but how did your health influence that? I mean, as far as like at that point, how old were you then?
21.
21? Okay,
Yeah.
so your health at that point was okay then?
It had been fairly stable.
Mm-hmm.
Like, once they figured out what was wrong with me at 13, which they eventually were able to figure it out. And at the end of that year, I had been hospitalized, and they tried all kinds of different uh, IV medications. And I was almost put on the transfer list for a lung transplant, but they were able to figure out what was going to do it for me. And from the age of 13 up until, I mean, really, I'd say up to like maybe even 2021, I was pretty nihilistic, just like, wow, totally like, rebellious
Mm-hmm.
and hating everything, but um, I was pretty stable. So I didn't have too much to bother me in the way of like the mutation. It wasn't causing too much problem because we'd figure out a middleman, a happy medium. And then it started to change again when I got pregnant and then had my daughter. And of
Right.
course, for women, your hormones change, your body changes. So it makes sense to me now. I didn't connect those things together then.
Um, See, this is the whole thing, and that I haven't really talked to you a lot about this, about how our psyches, our minds contribute to our illnesses or can actually create them. Like my example, well, I've had a few examples, but the whole cancer thing for me, and now I'm going through it again, I see that it's directly related to my psyche and what my psyche is going through. And these times in your life when you had these outbreaks, like when you're 13, that's a big cycle change for you know, a person, whether they're a male or female. It's when you're, going directly into puberty, and it's a whole life cycle change. And to me, just looking on the outside, I could say that perhaps some of the symptoms that started to occur during that time is part of this whole psyche change. And then the same thing when you had your daughter and getting pregnant, and that also is incredible as far, I mean, everything's connected, right? Our hormones and to our bodies and all this are so interconnected. And I totally see how these different life cycles, these different times of your life can stimulate certain symptoms from happening. One thing I remember reading that chapter about you when you went and you had your daughter over there, and then your symptoms got really bad. And then that was also the impetus for you to leave your relationship. You were married and you left your child over there. And that's an archetypal story in itself. That's like it's almost like the Persephone archetype, where her mother has to leave her daughter to Hades, right? And so that kind of pain of leaving your child must have been just horrific.
It was very difficult. And just note, you are totally correct. There is, I mean, now I understand this, after I've been analyzing it for so long, but when I was 13, both of the times when I was 13 and then again when I was 20 and 21, these were both times in my life that were very chaotic, very emotionally stressful. And I didn't understand much about who I really was. So that did cause a lot of my problems, And I mean, even though CF is a genetic condition, that doesn't mean that it'll necessarily create disease. So outside influences do this, whether it's a physical or a spiritual one. I totally believe that now.
Mm-hmm.
And when like one of the things that kind of spurred me on in like kind of a, totally subconscious way was when I was pregnant with my daughter.
Mm,
So this was like really a stressful time for me, and I was battling against people who were kind of working against me because they didn't know any other way to be, really. I mean, they were just going by what was considered normal behavior. But for me, the absolute worst possible outcome was that my daughter was born with
mm,
CF. And so this was like a huge problem for me. And I ended up, I mean, like, that's all I actually thought about was that it was an unacceptable option that she was born with CF. So when I think about that now and how I reacted to that situation, like I was in a foreign country and I went off every single medication I had been put on except for the enzymes that help me digest food.
mm-hmm.
That was the only one I thought would have no side effects to a fetus. Everything else was pretty toxic. I was trying, and then I was putting out this like psychic type of thought, even though I wasn't in a stage then where I am now. I was more materialistic, more just, you know, earth based, everything was physical, I didn't think outside of that. I put out in the thought into the world, like just mentally, that it isn't a hope, or it wasn't something I was praying for in my head. I just said it is absolutely unacceptable that she is born with CF and with any kind of unhealthy problem. And it was kind of a surprise when she was born completely healthy without CF. And that was, they had told me at that time that that's completely unlikely. It's not something that really happens. It's because, I mean, they're explaining it by the physical, materialistic type of world with science, in regards to science of what's possible, what's not possible. So I kind of feel like I put something into action there where I took certain steps and I, just made it impossible for it to take
Yeah,
place. And
that's
that was like one of the
mm,
biggest first things that happened to me. And I didn't really realize it or connect a lot of those pieces together until much later on in my life. So it was what really maybe kind of started everything
mm-hmm.
for me.
That is God's will working through you. That is how manifestation works. It's through the connection between the unknowable God or the mysteries and your soul, and then you connect that with your heart, and that recipe together is like the alchemical vessel of pure manifestation. It's really beautiful. So, have you been able to utilize that? That seems to be a key here in your growth of your life. Is were you able to learn how to use that again in other aspects of your life?
Yeah. I mean, now I understand this as like I look at it as sort of a scientific formula,
Mm-hmm.
thought, emotion, action, as like a tool that we can tap into and use like a fork or knife. So I wasn't even anywhere near this idea. Like, I didn't know anything about manifestation. I didn't know anything about any of this stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
At that time. And there was another big incident in my life that happened. Well, it was connected to that,
Mm-hmm.
after the time where when I was in Ireland, I was actually given My daughter was about 3 years old. And I was given my time, which means you have this much
Mm,
time left. This is what your body. And so this was the official medical thing. I was given 2 years
mm.
maximum. And I was like, okay, this
How
is
old were you
not
then?
this. Uh, I guess I was probably about 25,
Right,
maybe. It wasn't that long
right.
afterwards.
And now you're
So
40, right? Are you just
40 next
yeah.
year, yeah. Yeah.
So I just wanted
So
our
it
listeners to understand somebody tells you you have the medical establishment tells you that you have 2 years to live.
mhm,
Right.
yeah. And when I was 6 months old, they gave me 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
So I've come to learn that, you know, you don't always just take what you're hearing as the gospel truth. You take it into consideration and then see what you can do to problem solve. So when that happened, I had a really very difficult decision I had to make.
Mm,
And I had to weigh a lot of the physical and the emotional, psychological things that were coming with that. So in my head, I could not justify being somebody who allowed their 3 year old, because my daughter was with me full time, to watch their parent just waste away for however many years it took. This, I know from talking to other people and from reading about it, is very difficult. And
mm-hmm.
for me, it's an unacceptable option to give my daughter any kind of trauma. So that was where I had focused a lot of my thought at that time. That's how I organized it in my head and how it made sense. So I did put her in the care of her father for her youth. And I returned to the United States because I figured the most likely thing that was going to happen was my mother would be making my arrangements.
Mm,
And I got very lucky. But during that time before I got lucky, I had been thinking, okay, either my arrangements are going to be made for me, which is the most likely, or somebody is going to come along that's going to go, I have an idea
mm,
and let me see what I can do with
mm-hmm.
you. And that's what happened. I met a specialist who decided who were willing to take me on as a patient.
Mm-hmm.
And they were able to work with me until I actually improved. And when they did the original workup, and this is why I got the 2 year cap, was when she did the first workup on me, she's like, your whole left bottom lung is completely rotted out. And according to that system or mode of thought, you can't just regenerate rotted organs. Like they cut it out, they replace it, whatever. But you can't just heal it or heal it to an extent where it'll matter too much. You could live with it, but it's not going to be a fun experience. So over the course of 7 years, before she even thought about putting me on a transplant list, which was an option I could go down, but didn't really want that. Um, we figured out a regimen that might help actually bring me back, which at the time was unlikely because it was like a 15% lung capacity, which is like breathing through, if you had a quarter, that's how much
Mm.
15% your lungs looks like. So it was very difficult to bring me back from that. So she had, this regimen she put together, but this was another moment, another part of my life where I had myself and my current husband who's with me, and we just put in this energy that must have done something.
Mm-hmm.
And every day that I was apart from my daughter, the one thought was in my head again, I need to, like, it wasn't an option. It wasn't, I hope, it wasn't, I'm praying to get better so I can go back and be with my kid. It was, I am going to fix this and return to my kid. It wasn't
Right.
optional. It wasn't something I hoped for. It was something that was going to happen. And this, I think, was another instant before I actually started to really figure a lot of this stuff out
Mm-hmm.
where I accidentally manifested something that happened, like some kind of physical change, because at the end of that, they did a new evaluation. The rot was gone out of my
Mm-hmm.
lungs. And she just shrugged her shoulders and, like, I don't know.
So during this time, did you were you getting more on the spiritual side with your now husband? Was it, did you figure anything out during that time that would add to how you are now?
I did start figuring out some, well, I started kind of evaluating my life a little bit, I think, and I released some toxic stuff that was in my life, and I started opening up for a new, you know, better environment, with people, and just how I lived and where I lived and how I did things and reacted to things. I tried
Mm-hmm.
to get better with that, and I put a lot of focus into that. And so it wasn't really spiritual,
Mm-hmm.
I would say. I'd say it was more just kind of understanding
Mm-hmm.
that there is such a thing as manifesting your reality
Mm-hmm.
into the physical. And it's about how you do that and how you use that tool. So, I don't know, those were just the two things that kind of set me off
Mm-hmm.
into figuring a lot of this other stuff out.
Yeah, one thing that you've said to me, and I wanted you to elaborate on it, is don't be afraid of pain, of fear of pain.
Mhm. Well, I mean, pain is something a lot of people have a difficulty with, I think, because it is, people have a lot of fear attached to that. They're afraid of being in pain. Well, we have a lot of things in our society that tell us that pain is bad. And yeah, it's definitely uncomfortable. It's definitely not something I wish on anybody. But I think that when people have pain, that they could use it to understand who they really are, and they could use it as a tool rather than something that is a disability.
How would you use it as a way to learn who you really are?
It's an alarm system. So it's talking to you. Your body's talking to you when you're in whatever pain you're having. So if it's psychological or spiritual or physical, whatever, I think it works all the same way. It's an alarm system. Your body is going off and it's saying, like, pay attention to me, address this, deal with it. Whether the solution is a psychological one or spiritual one or physical one, there's something that you're ignoring, and you need to figure out what that is. And so, I mean, I think that all of those types of pain, like, obviously physical pain is physical, but even emotional or psychological or spiritual pain, you can manifest more physical pain. if you don't address it. So, being somebody who deals with that quite a bit, I know when I'm not addressing it, when I'm not addressing it, or when I am addressing it, and trying to figure out where it's actually coming from. And if people really listen instead of just like running for an opiate or some sort of band aid feel good solution, that's just a cover up.
Yeah.
But if they really look into how their body reacts, and if they can associate that with what is in their environment, what's going on with them, then there is a solution. You can use it to figure it out. And also, like, I know a lot of people who would rather just cover it up in a way where, like, oh no, if I have pain or whatever, I just want to immediately cover it up so I can't feel anything. But if you don't feel anything, then how do you know you solve the problem? So
Yeah.
that's, I'm sure other people have other methods, but that's how I think I just naturally
Yeah.
learned how to do
We
it.
have emotional processing in the book Shadow Tech, which Colony Davis, my partner, husband, and I wrote in 2015. And that's just basically, this is more, it's emotional pain that when you're triggered by something or something brings you pain from the outside, and it could be physical pain too, is that you allow it to be and then you just allow the feeling, allow the emotion to come to the surface, and it naturally processes it out when you don't fight it. So it's kind of a surrendering to the pain. And
Hmm.
it can be done with physical pain too, though I've been dealing with a lot of physical pain right now, and I know where it's coming from and the whole deal with it. But in this case, I can say that the surrendering to the physical pain, if it's a certain intensity, is very challenging. When you're in a situation where your body is rebelling, and even though you've done the work of trying to figure out where it's coming from and maybe change your environment or have the conversation with the person or whatever it is, what do you do in the midst of a physical kind of eruption of this pain or discomfort? How do you deal with it?
Well, I have a lot of different varieties of options I can take as far as physical pain reliever, but sometimes I, I, I mean, it doesn't happen as often now because I recognize it for what it is. But I've had moments from my past where it's almost like this PTSD
Mm.
feeling. So nothing's really, I mean, I'm actually like, I'm used to being in some small amount of pain. It's kind of my normal now.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of just what it
Right, right.
is there. But like during moments, like say I'm remembering something from my past and it just kind of like comes up, like how people describe what
Right,
PTSD
right.
is. And it really, like, I have a whole new understanding
Oh,
of
yes.
that
Mm-hmm.
now because when that happens, you really are, you think that it's
Yeah,
happening.
your body does,
So,
exactly.
yeah, your body
Mm-hmm.
remembers. So it it's like Like, for example, in 2021, I fell into, hypoxic respiratory failure, and it was pretty bad. And I recovered over that. I'm still kind of recovering, but I've mostly recovered over that. But I would still have like these flashes that would come up just out of nowhere, and they would last like 5 or 6 minutes maybe. And I felt it was like I was there
Mm,
again. Like I
mm-hmm.
could feel the physical pain of not being able to walk or breathe. So that stuff is completely real. And for stuff like that, when it's in that kind of way, I recognize it for what it is. It it's not real anymore. I mean,
Yes.
it was real,
Mm-hmm.
it happened,
Right.
but it's my memory. And
Mm-hmm.
because my memory, my attachment to that feeling is so strong, that's what's causing me to manifest that experience physically.
Yes, yes, exactly. I've had that exact same thing happen this year with me. I'm dealing with anxiety and fear that's coming from the past. That's total PTSD. And it's so chemical. And I know it's coming from these certain parts that I've been doing all this part work, but still, it's a totally somatic experience. It's coming out of my cells, and it's almost like what it is. I think that if you have PTSD or if you have that kind of pain and you recognize that it's coming from your past, or it could be even coming epigenetically, that if you recognize that and it starts to repeat itself, the awareness of it can definitely help the process for sure. It's still very intense. But I know that it does help. And I think so far my theory about it is that it's a way that the body mind is naturally processing this old stuff as a way of healing it. That's what I think it is. So I would say
Yeah.
anybody who is going through has this kind of pain or has an experience or an emotion that keeps repeating itself, it keeps cycling, and it comes through in a somatic way with a headache or a stomach ache, or and it keeps happening, that you really look at it as the body, mind, and the psyche all working together to heal it. So I totally agree with you there. I think that's exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
So there's a few things. So I put down some notes when I was reading your book. And one of the things I put down was a heart path about love, self love, compassion, self compassion, and self responsibility. Um, and is there anything you want to elaborate on those? Your a spirit about your spiritual connection, about love. Can you hear me? Did I?
Yeah. Yeah, I think you just clipped out a
Oh,
little bit.
okay. Did you hear what
Um,
I asked?
to elaborate
Yeah.
on that, yeah. So I, it's kind of weird. A lot of people seem to think that that kind of self-love stuff is this narcissistic behavior, but I think that nobody can really, you've got to give self-love. You've got to love yourself, and you've got to be able to recognize yourself with that, and if you're going to be able to produce that to others. So, and I think that's important that people do love themselves, and that they learn how to not necessarily forget, but to forgive others, and to forgive others and to forgive themselves for anything in the past, because it's the past and you can't change it anyway. And if you're able to recognize that, then you're able to change your present situation and change your behavior in the future for like whatever reason it is, whether it's good or bad or whatever. So I think it is important to have that in yourself. I mean, otherwise, you can't be a healthy individual. You certainly can't show others how to be healthy.
Do you find, as I've gone through my journeys, that I recognize the places where I've had parts. I call them parts. These are like the childhood parts that have gotten separated by my core and are either protecting me or they're exiled or I'm working with them. Now I know all these different parts, but I have a part that's called Mad Girl. And she's very angry that she couldn't solve the problems that she thinks her parents had, that she's very angry that she couldn't fix things, that she is angry that she couldn't be happy, and so there is a certain kind of anger. But as I've been going through my life and the whole process, I find that as I get in touch with her or that anger and where I've held it and how it's affected me and my life and my actions, I start to work with it, that I find that it transmutes itself into love, you know? I don't
Yeah.
know if you've had the same experience.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I used to be quite angry and resentful and put out. Like, I had kind of this attitude like, well, that's how it's gonna be. Life, I'm gonna be this like sick girl all the time. So I had a lot of unhappiness about that. So, and eventually it did turn into me understanding that I just kind of directed a lot of that unhappiness in the form of a lot of it, I think, was physical abuse I did to myself. I was just doing it myself, abusing, being kind of nihilistic in a way where it's just party all the time and that kind of thing, because it didn't matter. Like, what did it matter? So, but eventually I kind of sifted through that and I figured out that it wasn't my fault. So, how I was directing that anger was I was digging my own grave. I had to realize it wasn't my fault. It's not my fault. And well, I was handed a hand of cards, and now I've got to work with it, and I've got to stop feeling sorry for myself and figure out how to play the hand in a way where I'm going to win.
Yeah.
So I kind of looked at it like a poker game, I guess. And it's all how clever can I get with my hand, and bluffing and making it work. Which cards to throw out,
Mm.
which cards to pick up.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of looked at it more like that, and a lot of the pain that I had really did was coming from this concept of me having a child's disease
Right.
and being a sick girl. And I just had to, I didn't really get into where I analyzed a lot of it to such an extent where I categorized it so much. It was more like I kind of just woke up one day and I'm like, I need to get over
Mm-hmm.
this and grow up and just accept responsibility for what now is, and just deal with it.
Right. That's again, that's the warrior, but also with a lot of magician. The magician's the one who figures out and is able to analytically problem solve. Um, Before we end, because I know we've been going on for a while, but so now you're doing all this really incredible work. So you wrote your autobiography, which is amazing. So anybody, the links are below, and you can buy her book and read for yourself what a great story that she has to tell, and it's very inspiring. But also, you have your own store. It's your website, but it's also Etsy, right? You have your Etsy store, and
Yeah.
so tell us a little bit about your life art of all these different things that you're doing.
Well, most of my work is really community based. So I use the Etsy store just because sometimes that's just easier for people who are maybe international or not local, and they can commission me to make whatever. Usually, I make a lot of these, well, they're like I call neck meditation pillows. I make slippers, things like that. It's usually a lot of things like that, little blankets, stuff like that. And then I make a listing for it. So most of the stuff I have is stuff I make
Mm-hmm.
in the local community that I get a lot of commissions for. Not a lot, but enough. But a lot of people might use the Etsy even locally just to, give me the donation or whatever.
But
So I do use the Etsy, and the book is listed on there as well.
so you make clothes, right?
Hmm.
And you'll do commissions for that for like people who want costumes or wedding. I've seen you do some wedding dresses, and
Hmm.
you're very good. They're beautiful, everything that I've seen on there. And then you make these really cute little stuffy creatures, right? Those are like knit.
Yeah.
They're like,
They're they're mostly, it's all crochet
mm-hmm,
is what I use now, just because it's a little bit easier
mm-hmm.
to put them together with crochet. So I made these little amigurumi, I think they're called,
They're
stuffed
very
toys
cute.
that,
I've seen like
yeah,
some people who've had them who are new mothers and they give them to their babies, or yeah, they're great little for baby showers, you know. They're really
yeah,
adorable. And then you're also teaching, right?
yeah. In Ireland, I had a group called Knitters for Life, which we did a lot of community activities. We did art exhibitions. They have in Ireland, and I think also in England, they have a TV program called Nationwide, which we were featured in that at one point. We did like a lot of different things with the Knitters for Life group, and I would teach. I recently restarted that
Oh, that's
group
great.
at a local place here where I live, and I'll teach people how to knit and crochet or sew or whatever is really on their mind. But we do go into a lot of this kind of topic as well. We'll talk about things like thought, emotion, action. We'll talk about things that go on in the world. We'll talk about all sorts of things. Sometimes it's natural law, sometimes it's this, politics or religion or whatever, it's like whatever kind of comes out. And then I try to give them information that may help them find whatever clear or perception or perspective that they're needing to see whatever it is they're needing to see more clearer. And I feel like it does help. The people who usually end up coming to my class are people who feel, or who I think may have, they don't necessarily fit in with the crowd. So I don't know if that's just the energy I put out because I have this open door policy, or I'm not sure why it's like that. But I'm happy that there's a place for people who need that kind of community, in real physical world
That sounds
behind them. Like,
great.
so
Yeah. Have you ever thought of doing that? Do you have an online community that you do that with?
I I don't really yet. I do have a YouTube page called Sewing Class. I think I have it. It's called Sewing Class with Sara Cross, and I put up a few videos on that as far as DIY instructions. It's also on Odyssey. Um, and Odyssey, I kind of like more. I try to promote that a little bit more because with Odyssey, you can actually go on and you can download the videos and all the written in instructions and the templates. You can download those for free and print them out or watch them offline. You don't have to be on the internet for that. So that's why I kind of like that, is because you can have like an actual physical memory bank if you want. And I'm going to be using that channel every month. I'm going to try to put out a new video for the Knitters for Life group, and anybody who wants to join in it virtually, that they can do that. Um, and it's going to be going through some of the things we talked about throughout the month of whatever it is, whatever it happens to be, and some sort of lesson that I'm going to try to put with
Oh,
that
that's great.
for people to think about. And I'm going to go through the knitting or the crochet or the sewing or whatever things we did during that time period. So, because I learned that when I was knitting or crocheting or whatever it was, or sewing, I actually find that really relaxing. So, just doing that task and having the silence around me while I'm doing it gives me a lot of opportunity to just kind of go inward, think about information that I like go through for the day that has nothing to do with sewing or knitting or whatever. And I can actually, go through and analyze whatever it is. Like if it was having a bad day because of one situation, then I can actually pick that apart and see it for what it really is. Or if I was having a good day, then I can pick that apart and really, you know, bring myself, so I'm comfortable with it.
Basically, it
So
seems like it's a way of meditation.
a little bit, yeah. I mean, that's how I kind of use it. it's not something I'm trying to do quickly, or I don't give myself time limit. I'm not rush, rush, rush.
Right.
I don't do that with anything. Again, that's like a skill I had to learn. I used to feel very impatient with myself and with the world, but that's conditioning of the problems with CF.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had to learn that there really is no time limit, and I shouldn't be giving myself this time limit, because that's just creating more physical stress. So when people are trying to figure out and learn who they really are, or about reality, or whatever it is, they give themselves all this time limit stress.
Yeah.
That makes
We're
sense.
in a world that is very impatient. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, speaking of which, I think we've gone on for, I think it feels about right. We heard your story. And again, thank you, Sarah, so much for telling us, whoever's listening to this. I think that you are living your gold, as other people will hear. And I hope that it's inspiring to others. And I just wanted to end by a quote that you put in your beginning of one of your chapters from Saint Francis of Assisi. I hope that's how you pronounce it. And it's start by doing what's necessary, then do what's possible, and suddenly you are doing the impossible. So that's a good lesson for us all. And again, thank you so much, Sarah, for being on the very first interview of Living Gold podcast.
Thank you, Melissa, for having me.
All right, and all the links. Oh, and if you want to support Shadow Tech, or actually support me right now, because I can't work normally because of going through what I'm going through, a medical situation, unexpectedly, cancer, cervical cancer. So I can't afford to pay for anything alternative, and I definitely could use your support. So you can buymeacoffee.com under Melissa Mari, and I'll have PayPal links below too. So any kind of help would be definitely be grateful. All right. Thanks again, everyone, and thank you, Sarah. Bye.
Bye.